Thank you, everyone. First of all, I have to thank Susan Boynton, who did not introduce herself as our faculty director here at the Institute. Thank you for organizing the series. Thank you to all the our administrative staff, Eve, Marie, Grant, and the amazing Cyril, who is our wizard of all things technical. Without you, I wouldn't be here because I wouldn't have the technology to be able to do this. I'm the first in this series, and as my fellows have been saying, I am the guinea pig. But it's a delight to be the guinea pig because in so many ways I just believe that this is a wonderful opportunity to begin to process the beginning of this project with you. So as a beginning of a project, I have to, as I'll say at the end of this talk, these are works in process, thoughts in process. But I think that one of the best things about an institute like this and a series like this is that it gives us the opportunity to think together before we've drawn any conclusions. So, Grant, I'm going to ask you to turn off that light because I realize you can't see the writing on it without that. I thought, yeah, the top light, so the bottom switch, and then I'll get started. That's better, right? Okay. So, this summer, I embarked on a writing project inspired by an extraordinary group of students I taught in a seminar at the Institute for African American Studies at Columbia, and the seminar was called The Practice of Refusal. I wrote the series also based on a series of dynamic conversations with a group of scholars and artists I convened a few years ago that shared the same title, which is the Practicing Refusal Collective. The project in question was called Black Visual Frequency, a Glossary. And it appeared as a 5-part series in the Winter Tour Photo Museum their online forum, Still Searching. It's a piece that I describe as a thought experiment that attempts to map out a vocabulary for thinking with, through, and alongside Black contemporary artists who I argue are creating a radical practice of witnessing that refuses the authoritative forms of visuality, which function to refuse Blackness in many ways itself. They are practices that do not conform to some of the higher profile rubrics, often referenced by terms such as Afro-pessimism or Afrofuturism. They're practices that function instead through relationality and adjacency. Their power, as I will argue, lies in their ability to engage negation as generative. Building on the thought experiment that I began this summer, my talk this evening presents 3 glossary entries that articulate what I see as crucial critical frameworks for theorizing the practice of refusal that I argue defines contemporary Black visuality. Each entry is structured around an example of a genre of images and image-making practices that I call still-moving images. Still-moving images are images that blur the lines between stillness and movement, and they create forms of visuality that challenge viewers to confront their own relationship to the precariousness of Black life in the 21st century. But as I've maintained for some time in my writing on the visual culture of the African diaspora, our engagement with the visual is never restricted to the sensory realm of vision or sight. For our encounters with images and the ways they touch, move, and affect us always register through a much broader sensorium. For this reason, in order to talk about images and still-moving images in particular, I have to make a detour into the realm of sound and what I've described elsewhere as the frequency of images. But more on that in a moment. So, glossary entry number 1, still-moving images. Still-moving images. Images that hover between still and moving images, animated still images, slowed or still images in motion, or visual renderings that blur the distinctions between these multiple genres. Images that require the affective labor of feeling with or through them. Three skylines, devoid of architecture, flora, or fauna, blend one by one into variously populated land, city, and seascapes. Vivid colors intermingle sunrise and twilight, gradually blanching into industrial black and white scenes of urban life, only to shift back to verdant tropical tableaus. A triptych of screens vie for attention by cycling through a vibrant archive of still and moving images. Their evolving colors hypnotize as this trilogy moves viewers between and among them. The installation presents a distinctive modality of Black visuality carefully curated through the masterful vision of John Confront and his extraordinary collaboration begun in 1997 with two members of the acclaimed British cinecultural group Black Audio Film Collective, Lena Gopal and David Lawson. With the Confront, they comprise the award-winning production team Smoking Dog Films, whose collective cinematic prowess shimmers in this remarkable filmic assemblage. While the explicit focus of the film is the cultural theorist Stuart Hall, the unfinished conversation is neither documentary nor biography, rendering instead a vivid account of diasporic transformation. It traces the arc of subjectivity that emerges for those coming of age in what Hall cites in the film as the most differentiated class and color system in the world. The installation moved through Hall's memories and ideas, positioning him as at once within and beyond strictures of race, class, and color in the Caribbean and in Britain, within and beyond exhortations of national, colonial, and metropolitan desire and belonging. While it routes this account by way of Hall's intellectual, political, historical, and geographical trajectory, it is a story that exceeds this seminal figure. It is the story of a generation rather than an individual. It is the story of an individual's relation to a generation and the enduring ways this generation's legacy continues to resonate in the present moment and into the future. It is a visual enactment. Double-sided printing always will kill you, enactment of Hall's touchstone definition of identity as, quote, the different ways we are positioned by and position ourselves within the narratives of the past. Echoing this profound enunciation, the unfinished conversation subtly arranges both its viewers and its subject within this relationship. With haunting elegance, it positions us alongside Hall as witnesses to the creation of post-colonial Black subjectivity in ways that recalibrate memory, temporality, and the visual archive marshaled to render this subjectivity. But it is perhaps more revealing to engage this proposition as a question rather than a statement. How does the unfinished conversation recalibrate Blackness in diaspora in the looping temporality of empire, migration, and decolonization? As a video installation, the easy answer to this question would focus on what we see and the captivating images it distills and refracts. But my rejoinder is, perhaps as ever, stubbornly counterintuitive. For it is not so much what we see in the images, but more importantly, how we apprehend them, namely through sound. As a committed audiophile of images, what captured me the first time I viewed the unfinished conversation continues to compel my attention in every subsequent encounter. The phonic substance of its intricate visual composition and its irrepressible capacity to animate a visual archive that defies conventional conceptions of genre and form. It stages a moving encounter with an archive of images we interact with not just through sight, but more profoundly by listening to the interplay of the multiple sonic textures of their visuality. Indeed, the unfinished conversation presents a tantalizing instantiation of still-moving images that require us to engage the overlapping sensory realms of the visual, the sonic, and the haptic, as well as the affective labor that constellates in, around, and in response to such images. The still-moving imagery of the unfinished conversation demands our affective labor through its capacity to touch or move us and the complex interaction it creates between the sonic and visual substrates of this richly textured work. layering music, voice, and ambient noise with still and moving images, the installation creates an effectively charged tableau vivant that queries the relationship between sound and image, which in turn challenges viewers to engage blackness as a sonic visuality that collapses the distinctions between still and moving images. Blurring voice, soundtrack, and noise, the soundscape of the unfinished conversation amplifies the film's capacity to render both the interiority and the multiple historical temporalities of its subject. In doing so, it reconfigures the acoustics of the image to render a multisensory account of blackness in diaspora and blackness suspended between metropole and colony. A man's voice, a child's voice, an interview, a newscast, speech layered over a phonograph, layered over sounds of a city, sea, and country. The Triptych Montage, a multiplicity of moving images, film, video, newsreel, that in turn collage the movement of bodies across these variegated scapes. The motion of workers in the metropole, the routinized path of a mail carrier serially approaching the thresholds of seemingly identical English homes, a choreographed mass of black and white bodies marching in protests, contrasts with the violent dispersal of another mass deemed in violation of the limits of white tolerance. The unfinished conversation layers these moving images with videos of still photos, filmed footage of framed photographs staged, or more accurately posed on shuttered window frames, behind which we glimpse longer views of seashores or oceanic vistas. Photos mounted on trees in luscious groves, photos transposed over or suspended in front of textured, translucent textiles. They're photos of a young brown man alone with friends, relatives, and loved one on both sides of the Atlantic. Each image is displayed in relief, imaged in three-dimensional relief as cinematized still lives, but also relieved of the burden of documentation. They're still moving images that conjure an archive of diasporic feeling, animated by the work's ability to set these still images into unlikely forms of motion. Domestic pictures of individuals and families intermingle with candid shots of the comings and goings of black folks en masse. Newspaper images of urban squalor and alienation are juxtaposed with heady scenes of black Commonwealth citizens disembarking from boats and trains. Arriving at the other end of transatlantic journeys, their faces beam hopeful and full of aspiration. Photographs of activists at work, at desks and in meetings, at rallies giving speeches and marching alongside comrades in arms, interspersed with scenes of armed resistance in the resistance to colonization in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Northern Ireland. They are stilled only in relation to the movements that frame them, billowing fabrics, the ebb and flow of waves, the flutter of leaves. As photos, they exemplify stillness, yet they are anything but. As the eye moves from screen to screen, images intermingle with sounds, images, songs, speech. They neither illustrate nor document. They animate the history, memory, and affects of complex narratives of blackness in diaspora, empire, and Britain. So I'm going to show you a clip that doesn't encapsulate everything because it's a 40-minute film, but I'm just going to show you like 7 or 8 minutes. Akomfra's seamless composition of still-moving images in the unfinished conversation are inextricable from and enlivened by their merger with the ambient sounds of everyday life. These include the steps of a single individual walking on a sidewalk, morphing into marching masses and scuffles of confrontation, the sounds of protest against militarism, racism, police violence, and the murder of black and brown people in the streets of cities across the UK. Also audible are the unmistakable soundscapes of ports of departure and arrival, crowing seagulls, a bellowing foghorn, the whistle of an arriving train ferrying new arrivals from coast to city center. And waves return again and again throughout the film. Waves of migration and relocation merge with flood waves, ocean waves, or sound waves floating from Miles Davis's horn or Duke Ellington's piano, waves of crowds chasing and attacking, waves of protesters in the street, waves of military incursion, waves that spark the bolt of a horse from a wagon and a desperate woman struggling to tame the chaos, rippling finally and inexplicably into the footage of a baby emerging from the womb, accompanied by the irresistible hum of Mahalia Jackson's refrain. They are waves of fugitive movement, the birthing movement of decolonization and diasporic refusal. We are moved by the vibrant tapestry of still-moving images a comfra assembles in the unfinished conversation, but we are moved not just by what we see. We are moved by our encounter at multiple levels of the sensorium. We cannot simply view the images assembled. We must engage them by listening to the multiple layers of their sonic substrate, a sonic dimensionality that is inherent and immanent to its imagery, for it is a visual composition that requires listening. Here, I must supplement this first glossary entry with an additional term that's an essential component of my conception of still-moving images and their significance as a modality for representing Black visuality. Glossary entry 2, frequency. Frequency. In acoustics, the number of complete vibrations or cycles occurring per unit of time in a vibrating system, such as a column of air. Frequency is the primary determinant of a listener's perception of pitch. Harvard Dictionary of Music. Frequency, the rate of repetition of a regular event, the number of cycles of a wave, or some other oscillation or vibration per second, is expressed in hertz, or cycles per second, the Oxford Dictionary of Physics. Single images of black, brown, and white bodies flash across a screen for seconds or mere fractions of seconds. When white bodies appear, they seem jarringly white, whiter than white, paler than pale, at times almost translucent. Many are iconic performances of what might be considered badass whiteness, rebellious, provocative, profane. These musicians, singers, models, and stars merge with black and white cartoons and caricatures, and their equally badass black counterparts who punctuate alternating frames with bodies in groups as individuals and manifestly disembodied fleshly pieces. Apex, created in 2014, is an energizing and unsettling eight-minute film by Arthur Jafa. Heralded as a black cinematographic maestro, Jafa has recently garnered global accolades for his astonishing homage to the vicissitudes of black pleasure and pain. Love is the message is death. Sorry. Apex anticipates this celebrated piece with an intensity and tenacity that in many ways exceeds its contemporary sibling. The film animates a remarkable selection of still photographs and carefully curates them to provoke visceral responses. In the midst of this relentless loop, while only 2 images actually move, the unmistakable pop and lock of Flex Dancer Storyboard P and a heavenly line of flight that tracks the path of a barely moving aerial object, Apex's images are gripping, explicit, and at times unbearably graphic. Photographic depictions of the aftermath of lynchings, burnings, torture, and brutal violence intermingle occasionally with intertwined bodies, bare breasts, or bottoms. Each frame presents a photograph that appears in a split second only to be replaced by another image at the rate of a blink of an eye. This blistering sequence allows us to linger on none of them, yet each image registers like the flash of a camera that blinds us briefly and sears an effective halo onto the cornea of its viewers. The images register in high contrast, juxtaposing hyper-whiteness against the full spectrum of brown to blackness that refracts the distorted hue of white supremacy. Suturing the two is the play of painted faces, blackface as the negative mirror of stunning black faces. Black faces grimace defensively in pain, protection, or flexing the prowess of both male and female swagger. Black faces contort expressively in the quiet euphoria of reflection or the louder euphoria of excess, exhortation, and exuberance. Extending those faces into full corporality, black bodies lay prone and lifeless with flesh riven, exposed, mutilated, or dismembered. Interspersed among them are celestial bodies of suns, moons, planets, microbial monstrosities, aliens, and aquatic curiosities. Threaded from beginning to end, images of black bodies are and reassembled as iconic and mundane, fabulous and fierce, defeated and vulnerable, defiant and unfazed. Between and among this shifting palimpsest, the repetition of a familiar figure becomes a haunting refrain that merges black and white to mock us with unexpected foreboding. Mickey Mouse. It is neither what Jaffa's images show us, nor merely their depiction of pained and sublimely beautiful black bodies that make them register with such undeniable force. While he has famously stated that he aspires to create, quote, black cinema with the power, beauty, and alienation of black music, what provides the phonic substance of Apex's still but profoundly moving images? What makes them move across a screen, congealing in a sonic visual harmony, then reemerging to etch a chilling imprint on its viewers? Here we must return to the question of frequency. Or more specifically, we must refine the concept of frequency to interrogate the concept of pitch. For while frequency measures the cycle rate of the physical waveform, pitch is how high or low it sounds. If we move beyond the understanding of identity as that which is supposed to give us a sense of our position in the world, right? If we think about it as adjacency and relationality, what do those moving images do? What they do is they highlight the extent to which we are used to seeing moving images in film, when this is a film about still images that move, still images that he makes move. And that the relief of, right, seeing an actual thing move across a screen, right, which is what we think of as the moving image, suddenly dissolves, right? Because we've been actually seeing moving images, but the only difference is that they don't move within the frame, right? They move from frame to frame. So part of what I think the effect of that is the extent to which he's again troubling what is the difference between a still and a moving image by showing us, okay, there's a thing moving in this image, and that's how we used to define a moving image. We can't rely upon that anymore. Okay. Go ahead. Oh, lots of questions. Go ahead. Sorry, I missed the first one.
The first one is 3 simultaneous images.
Right.
I can see the credits very clear.
Okay.
Where is this from?
What do you mean? Where is it
The
from?
one about Jewish community.
Oh, so it's a series of interviews. Well, Stuart Hall had a television show. He used to broadcast, and he used to talk about identity and post-coloniality. And so one of the things that I love about that particular clip is literally he starts, Comfort starts the film where he's talking about his early life in Jamaica with Hall's description of identity in Britain from the perspective of the Jewish community, right? And he threads that into the inextricability that he's always talking about different diasporic identities, right? And so in so many ways it encapsulates the kind of capaciousness of Hall's thinking and the way in which he's never trying to make an argument about the specificity of himself, right? Or the specificity of the black colonial subject in Britain, right? That these are always linked for him. And so throughout the film, you see all the different ways in which he's commenting both on himself, but he's a representative of a larger formation. And that formation is not restricted to blackness in a conventional sense, right? It's really always about empire, right? And it's about the legacy of empire and its enduring impact.
It's really complex, the first one.
Yeah, it's really complex, and it gets more complicated. And I saw you on. Oh, Amit.
Somebody else.
No, both of yours are right together. Please, go ahead.
Go for it. Yeah, of course. There's a microphone.
I really like the idea of still moving images.
and I think you brought it together really nicely at the end. I like part 1 and 3 a lot in relation to what you're saying. And maybe we can talk about that further tomorrow. Part 2, which has been discussed so far, was making me think and making me slightly uneasy. And I was trying to sort of understand what it was. I was looking at this interesting sort of obedience to the rhythm as far as except for somewhere towards the last third of the sequence, the obedience to rhythm in terms of the images changing in relation to the music that was being played, and the rhythm itself obeying itself, except when a particular kind of layering came in where 2 notes were added, where rhythm then began to be disrupted slightly. That was interesting. But then there was also a few other things which were striking me. Those disruptions I liked, by the way. But what was being confirmed over there seemed to be more than the other things which you were talking about in terms of resistance to explaining, let's say, what blackness is. The other things seem to be confirmed over there in terms of, well, I like the fact that there was equal weight being given to everything. So it wasn't as if the romantic on the mountaintop was slowed down for.
Right.
It sort of passed away in a moment, just as Miles Davis did, or the cover of Blood on the Tracks did. That was good again. So I was thinking about it, and yet there was a connection between the Friedrich, which represented a kind of high cultural inheritance, and Miles Davis and the other political pictures, in terms of these are known pictures. And so I think in terms of, in relation to both high culture and popular culture, in terms of how many of these images do I know? How many of them can I spot? That's a kind of habit of responding to culture, which this kind of seemed to confirm in a certain way. How many do I know? How many do I already have in my kind of memory hoard? I know that one. I know that one too. It might be Friedrich, it might be somebody else. And then the centrality of the human figure. Right. Why this centrality?
So can I jump in?
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to challenge the centrality of the human figure, which is really contrasted by all of the non-human figures, right? That the aliens and the microbes and the celestial, right? So you have all these creatures and otherworldliness that is competing, right, with the human, which I want to say is trying to get us to decentralize the human.
But no
right?
space, no vacancy. I mean, there's always a human or some kind of transmutation of
But again, that will go to the second point, which is from which vantage point is what legible, right? Because I don't know that we're recognizing the same things, right? And that's part of the challenge of this particular kind of seriality in doing what you're actually saying is that there is an equivalence being set up, right? There's an equivalence being set up between high art, between journalistic accounts of genocide, and massacre, between popular cultural icons, between, contemporary popular cultural icons and historical cultural icons, between, sort of anonymous, between, microbial views, right, of the subvisual, right? That's also something that we're seeing, right? And so that desire to set up a kind of equivalency that's not premised upon recognition, right? And where the recognition is actually undermined by literally the velocity of your exposure to it, right? What that does is it provokes in us, again, weak effect onto the thing that we recognize, right? Because otherwise you're lost, right? You're completely lost, and that, I think, is also intentional. So what happens when you give yourself over to, right, both the thing you recognize and the thing you do not want to see, right? Like, a severed head, right? Or, face down bodies, right? One of the things that does is it makes you open to both the affective charge of recognition, reassurance, right? Knowledge of. And at the same time, as soon as you get there, you are undermined. You are completely, the ground is taken out from under you because you're so focused on that. And then when a mutilated body comes in, you are equally open to that, right? You don't have the capacity to sort of shut down and open up again, right? And so one of the arguments I'm trying to make about what this does, this particular kind of still moving image, and the seriality of it, and the montage, and the sound of it, right, is that it requires a certain amount of labor, right, that we need to attend to. And that labor is important to me, particularly around the question of race and gender, right? That not being able to have a narrative, not being able to get comfortable with these,
yeah.
right? Okay. Emika, and then Jenny, and then there's questions here too. Sorry.
You probably know AJ's work a lot. You probably research on him. I'm really curious because I've seen his shows and seen a lot of his works. I'm really curious how copyright comes in the use of the still images, because I know that song from Robert Hood, and most of the images, or all of the images, I'm sure AJ didn't take them. No. How does copyright come into this? Because he's also a commercial artist now, right? Yeah.
Well, so no, very few of these were taken by AJ. But that's also part of his practice. His practice is archival, profoundly archival, of, he describes himself as a kind of, obsessive digital artist who's really sort of mining the imagery that is available on the web. But copyright comes in to the extent that it is only when this was made, several years ago. Mm-hmm. And he hasn't been able to release it until recently because of copyright, because he couldn't afford it, right? And so, for example, Love is the Message was something that could not be released until he got a gallery. Yeah. And he didn't have a gallery until literally, I would say, about 3 or 4 years ago. Yeah. And it's the gallery that managed to go to work to be able to allow him to, resolve some of the copyright issues. But for example, in Love is the Message, one of the things that you see, which is the evidence of that, is you will see Marvel, you will see Getty, you will see all of those different, superscripts over the material because he couldn't buy it. Right? So he didn't erase the fact, and I think that's important, he didn't erase the fact that many of these archival and iconic images are owned by corporations, right? Yeah. And so in order to use these things, which have actually shaped our popular, understanding of the history of Black folks, globally and transnationally, are commodities that the only way you can show them is by showing who owns them. And that's how he's gotten around some of these issues, is by just sort of saying, I'm not gonna take the clean version of it. I'm going to allow you to claim ownership, and that way I get to show it. So, Jenny.
I had a question about the middle film too. It's amazing to watch it in a large scale room. Yeah. It really is physiologically uncomfortable. The lack of synchronization. Yeah. And the obtrusive nature of the beeping, and the ways that the images are then barraging you very more quickly than we can do it. It stresses you physiologically in a way that really is intense. But I was thinking, obviously the 20th century history of sort of fast still images is one that comes out of psychology and conditioning and so forth. I was thinking of something like, the sequence in The Clockwork Orange is probably the most famous artistic, depiction of this and so forth. But the thing that I remained unclear, or maybe even a little bit uneasy about after seeing the piece that you showed us, it's so tricky to do that kind of collage work as critique rather than as some kind of a reproduction of mechanisms that are so profoundly implicated in kinds of control, corporate and so forth. So I guess I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about your responses to the piece,
Right.
about whether you really think that it succeeds in making the kind of intervention that it seems to be shooting for.
I think it succeeds. I know that there are others who may not agree with me. I'm not concerned with that. Because I think it succeeds by virtue of the discomfort, right? If we weren't uncomfortable, then it would not succeed. And the level of the discomfort is also, and that's what I think is really important about the particular frequencies and pitches of it and its synchronization of sound and image, is that inextricability that I'm getting at. Because, again, it doesn't have a soundtrack, right? It's not a relationship of, again, equivalence. It's a relationship of adjacency that puts us in the position of having to do the work to figure out, what is the fine line that it's crossing, when does it cross it, and when is it successful. I would also say it's not 100% successful, and that is also reassuring to me. So, I mean, the other thing about it is that I'm seeing it as part of a larger body of work, and that body of work develops over time. And that's what is interesting to me, is to look at this film in relationship to Love is the Message, or in relationship to an earlier work like Dreams Are Colder Than Death, and also to look at it in relationship to the commercial work that he's done in terms of music videos. And so how are the same components being used in different ways? And so from that perspective, I'm really interested in the practice, right? And what does the practice require us to do? And so in that respect, I think it is very, very successful, if not wholly. I don't know your name, but you had your hand up. Daniel, go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, what distinction do you make between this piece made by Louis Thompson, which is a New Zealand artist, and for instance, Dana Schutz's painting called Casket, Matil, which is very controversial,
Right.
The last Whitney, which was criticized because it was done by a white artist.
Yep.
How do you see this when it comes to positionality of the artist?
Right.
Because you were talking about the different sides of it, the different criticism that there was for this piece.
Right. The way in which I distinguish it is part of is the way in which Luke has positioned himself in relationship to it, which is to say that as a New Zealander of Pacific Islander heritage, and we need to think about what that means in New Zealand, right? In that place, right? What does that mean? And the argument that I'm trying to make is, why are we willing to discount or to separate out the histories of imperialism and colonization that link slavery to the Pacific Islands, right? So, I mean, I had a conversation with him, with Luke, where he was talking about what it meant to be raised by Fijians, and what it's meant to actually claim that heritage in a place like New Zealand, right? And how there is a relationship between these different systems that are not about him identifying with Diamond Phillips. It's not about him identifying as an African American, but identifying in the relationship that is about indigeneity in a place like New Zealand, right? So I'm never one who's actually going to make an argument for phenotype being, right, the index of one's relationship to oppression, imperialism, right, to race. And therefore, what he's actually trying to do is to be able to articulate something that is adjacent to, right, the politics of race and gender in New Zealand, even if it's in the United States. Dana Schutz isn't making that claim, right? Dana Schutz isn't making any kind of argument. Dana Schutz is making art, right, for art's sake. And that's my distinction, I would say.
May I add a
Please.
second part to this question? That how would you, I don't know, maybe problematize the fact that this is circulated in a particular context, in the contemporary art world, which is a very elitist context. Like, this is very problematic. Maybe it's not from the positionality, because maybe he speaks from a subaltern position as well.
Okay.
Subaltern, like American to us. What about the fact that he's kind of like making art out of this and circulating the contemporary art world, which is a very secluded world. It's not an open world.
So my
Radical.
Sure. I mean, I've heard this point made before, and my response to it is, we have to start with art writ large, not the art world, but art writ large. To the extent that, if that's the argument about, okay, once art moves into the art world, right, then one is compromised. To me, the question is, art is a commodity, right? Art functions in a capitalist system, right? To make art and to even show it is about either you make art and you don't show it to anybody, right? And then you can be really, really, very superior, right? Then you are beyond the pale, right? But any person who makes art in this particular, globe on which we live is going to, on some level, be subject to, right, the capitalist model that we're not going to get out of, right? So, are you saying he needs to make art and not sell it, right? He needs to make art and not let it be shown in galleries? He needs to make art and he could never, so what, I just don't know what the alternative is, not to mention, because the other thing about it is, I talked to him a couple weeks ago and he was like, I'm poor. It's like, I don't eat well. All of the money that I have goes into the materials to make this, right? And so to that extent, we need to also think about the art world and where that money goes, right? So we need to not sort of fetishize the artist's, sense of being in the art world. And the other thing about it is, I saw this at the Berlin Biennale for the first time, right? Which was a show that was curated for the first time in a while by a group of curators of color who were trying to give us access to the work of artists of color that are not often shown. This was one of the most, one of the most well known of that. But again, it's difficult for me to accept the argument that artists of color should not be circulating in the highest circles of recognition. And part of the dynamic that we are experiencing now is what we're experiencing is the way in which that is transforming, the extent to which we can see artists getting the recognition that's based on the quality of their work, right? And that diversity is multiplying, right? My point of attack is capitalism, not the art world, but capitalism. So the art world is one place in which capitalism circulates. There are many, but the problem is not art. The problem is capitalism. That's how I respond. Sorry. Showing myself as a little bit of a Marxist there. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, and maybe just a follow-up to your question. This project, this work is part of a series of works that he's been doing.
Yes.
And he's really working off of Warhol's portraits. So Warhol did a number of portraits in the 60s and 70s. And when you look at that series, you realize that out of, say, 60 people, there are only possibly 3 people of color. And so part of this project is kind of redress that situation. Prior to this, he did at least 3 or 4 in this series. So, he's engaging directly with that sort of level of the art world by giving a rebuttal to Warhol. So he's using exactly the same camera, exactly the same film stock, he's presenting it exactly the same way. So those condition, his use of those materials and the conditions of both production and presentation are really engaging, and that's, I think, a crucial part of the artworks.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a long night. I think that we can wrap up now. Thank you for your questions.